There's a verse you've probably seen on a coffee mug or hanging framed on somebody's wall. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46, verse 10. We read it like a gentle suggestion. Light a candle, breathe deep, relax. But the Hebrew behind those three words wasn't whispered in a spa. It was shouted across a battlefield, over the clash of swords, at armies that would not stop fighting. And a lot of sincere Christians will tell you God feels distant, that he's gone quiet on them. What almost none of them consider is that the silence might not be coming from God's side at all. It might be that we've never once given him the one thing he keeps asking us for. So let's talk about it. Start with that famous verse, because most of us read it as if God is a yoga instructor. Be still. We hear it and picture something calm, a slow morning. But go back to the Hebrew, and the word is raphah. Raphah doesn't mean sit quietly and feel peaceful. Scholars translate it as let go, sink down, release your grip. Some render it cease striving. One word study describes it as a rope going slack. All the tension you've been holding suddenly let out. And in military language, that same word meant to drop your weapons. Stop fighting. Now, where does this verse actually sit? Not in a garden. Read the whole psalm and it opens with the earth giving way, mountains falling into the sea, nations raging, kingdoms shaking. It's the loudest chapter you can imagine. And right in the middle of all that noise, God's own voice cuts through and basically says, stop, drop it, quit fighting, let go, and know that I am God. So this was never a suggestion to feel serene. It was a command to surrender, to stop white-knuckling your life long enough to remember who actually holds it. There's a detail that makes it even richer. When Hebrew scholars translated the Old Testament into Greek centuries before Christ, they rendered raphah here with a word that meant to take a holiday, to be at leisure, to keep empty, unhurried time set aside for one thing. That's the invitation. Not another item on your spiritual to-do list, but clearing the room, making empty space with no agenda except God. Because think about how backwards we do this. When we feel far from God, our instinct is to do more. Pray louder, add another worship playlist, fill the silence with activity, because silence feels like nothing is happening. But this verse says the striving itself is the problem. You cannot hear a whisper while you're shouting. And that isn't just a nice idea. It's the exact lesson God taught one of the most famous prophets in the Bible, a man who had just watched fire fall out of the sky. His name was Elijah. If you don't know his story, you need it, because it's one of the strangest encounters with God anywhere in Scripture. Elijah had just pulled off the biggest miracle of his life. On Mount Carmel, he stood alone against hundreds of prophets of a rival god named Baal, and called down fire from heaven in front of an entire nation, the high point of his whole career. And then, one day later, a queen threatens to kill him, and Elijah falls completely apart. He runs into the desert, collapses under a tree, and tells God he wants to die. Sit with that, because it's painfully familiar. The crash didn't come during the battle. It came right after the victory. That's usually when it hits hardest. So God sends him to a mountain and tells him to wait, because he's about to pass by. What happens next is the whole point. First comes a wind strong enough to shatter rock. But the text says something jarring. God was not in the wind. Then an earthquake. God was not in the earthquake. Then a fire. And God wasn't in the fire either. And then, after all of it, came what the King James Bible calls a still small voice. That translation is doing a lot of work, though. The Hebrew is kol demama daka, and scholars have argued over it for centuries. Some say a gentle whisper. Others say a low murmur. But one respected modern translation renders it as something that sounds almost impossible. The sound of sheer silence, not the absence of sound. The sound of silence itself. The word for thin there describes something so fine it's nearly see-through, like dust slipping between your fingers. God didn't show up in the spectacle. He showed up in the quiet so quiet you could almost hear nothing at all. And most people miss the sharpest detail. Elijah had just beaten the prophets of Baal. Who was Baal supposed to be? The storm god. The god of wind and thunder and fire from the sky. So when the real God passes by, he deliberately refuses to appear in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. He won't be mistaken for a cheap idol. He won't perform on cue. He does the opposite of what everyone expects, and comes in the silence. There's an old rabbinic reading of this that goes even further. It suggests that what Elijah finally heard in that silence was the barely audible sound of his own breath. That God had brought him so low, so quiet, that the only thing left to hear was his own breathing. And in that, God connected up. Elijah was a man of noise and fire and public winds. When he was broken, God didn't answer with more fireworks. Elijah didn't need more proof that God was strong. He just watched fire fall from heaven. What he needed was to know God was near. And nearness, it turns out, speaks in a whisper. Power roars. Presence whispers. Which raises the obvious question. If God keeps choosing silence as his setting, then what is it about silence, specifically, that draws him? Why would that be his language? There's a line that gets passed around in Christian circles, credited to the old contemplatives, to saints like John of the Cross, and later the monk Thomas Keating. Silence is God's first language. The fuller version adds that everything else is a poor translation. At first, that sounds like poetry stretched too far. But think about how relationship actually works. Talking is how you get to know a stranger. Sitting quietly together, saying nothing, and feeling completely at home is what you do with someone you've known for years. We get silence wrong because we treat it as the absence of something, dead air to fill. But in Scripture, silence is full. It's the space where a presence you've been drowning out finally becomes noticeable. Think of static on an old radio. God isn't the loudest station on the dial. He rarely fights for the frequency. If you want the quiet signal, you have to turn everything else down first. Jesus modeled exactly this. When he taught people how to pray, he told them to go into their room, shut the door, and pray to the Father in secret. The Greek word he used for that room, timeon, didn't mean a nice study. It meant the inner storeroom, the pantry, the one windowless room in the house with no view and no audience, the place nobody could see you and nothing could distract you. He was describing a room built to strip away performance. Nobody to impress, no stage, just you and God in the dark and the quiet. And he didn't only teach it, he lived by it. Over and over, the Gospels show him slipping away from the crowds to lonely places to pray. Before choosing his disciples, before big decisions, before the hardest night of his life, he pulled away into solitude. Notice the order. He withdrew first, then acted. The silence wasn't him avoiding the work. It was where he filled up for it. He couldn't pour out in public what he hadn't first received in private. Now look at how we do it. Backwards. We act first and pray later, if at all. We run on empty and then wonder why we feel dry, why God feels far off, why nothing connects. But you can't withdraw from a silence you never entered in the first place. Which brings us to something remarkable. For one group of Christians, finding God in silence wasn't a nice devotional thought. It became the entire experiment of their lives, and they ran that experiment for 17 centuries. In the 4th century, something strange started happening. Christians began walking out into the deserts of Egypt and Syria on purpose. We call them the Desert Fathers and Mothers. They weren't leaving people because they hated them. They were chasing something they believed you could only find in extreme quiet, and they gave it a Greek name, hesychia, stillness, inner quiet, not just the absence of noise around you, but the settling of the noise inside you. That anxious, racing, self-obsessed chatter in the mind going quiet enough that you could finally pay attention to God. Out of that grew a whole tradition of prayer called hesychasm. For centuries, monks, especially in the Eastern Church and the monasteries of Mount Athos, built their entire spiritual lives around it. The core practice was almost shockingly simple. One short prayer, repeated slowly and quietly over and over, until it sank out of the head and down into the heart and became as natural as breathing. There's a famous story from those desert years. A young monk goes to one of the wise old fathers, desperate for the secret to the spiritual life, and the old man gives him a single line: "Go sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." That's it. No formula, no 7 steps. Just stay put, be quiet, and let the silence start doing its work on you. Because these people understood something we've mostly lost. You don't master silence in a weekend. It works on you slowly, the way water wears down stone. And here's why it matters for you. This wasn't a fringe group of eccentrics. This was mainstream Christianity for over 1,000 years. Some of the greatest theologians in church history defended the practice with everything they had, insisting that God really could be met in that deep inner stillness. For 17 centuries, serious Christians staked their whole relationship with God on the belief that He's heard most clearly in silence, not noise. And then, in about 1 generation, we built a world with no silence left in it at all. If this is giving you something to sit with, take a second to subscribe. We're walking through these practices one at a time, and I'd hate for you to miss the next one. Now to the hardest part of all of this, because sometimes the silence isn't peaceful at all. Sometimes it feels like God has left the room entirely. Let's be honest about the part nobody likes to admit. Sometimes you get quiet before God. You wait, you listen, and there's nothing. No warm feeling, no sense of His presence. Just a silence that feels cold and empty, like you're talking to the ceiling. In those moments, the silence doesn't feel like intimacy. It feels like abandonment, like God walked out. Scripture doesn't hide from this. There's a verse in Isaiah where the prophet just says it plainly, that God is one who hides Himself. The old theologians even had a name for it, the hidden God. So this isn't some modern crisis of faith. God's silence has troubled His people for as long as there have been people. The Christian mystics went through it so often, they mapped it out. John of the Cross called it the dark night of the soul, a season when all the warm feelings dry up, when prayer feels like talking into a void, when God seems to have pulled away every comfort you had. But this is where the old teachers say something that flips the whole thing over, and it might be the most important part of your entire spiritual life. They didn't believe the silence meant God had left. They believed it meant He was doing something deeper. Picture a parent teaching a child to walk. At some point, they let go and step back. Not because they've abandoned the child, but because they're standing a few feet away with their arms open, letting the child grow. The stepping back is the love. That's what these teachers thought God was doing in the silence, weaning us off the highs and the good feelings so we'd learn to love Him and not just what He hands us. So our faith would rest on Him being real instead of Him being loud. And there's a modern story that proves this isn't just theory. Mother Teresa, the most famous servant of the poor in the last century. After she died, her private letters were published, and they revealed something that stunned people. For roughly the last 50 years of her life, she felt almost nothing from God, a deep, aching silence, and she never stopped serving, never stopped praying. She kept showing up in the dark, faithful to a God she could barely feel. People call that weak faith. I'd argue it's the strongest kind there is. Loving God in the silence, when there's no reward coming for it, is about as pure as love gets. One more picture worth sitting with. In the book of Job, a man loses everything, and his friends come to comfort him. Do you know what they did right? For 7 days they sat with him and said absolutely nothing. That was their finest hour. The moment they opened their mouths and started explaining his suffering, they started getting God wrong. Sometimes the most faithful thing isn't filling the silence with answers, it's staying in it and trusting the one who's there even when he isn't saying a word. So, let's bring it home. Because there's a hard truth sitting under everything we've covered. We might be the most noise-saturated humans who have ever lived. And it isn't only loud sound, it's constant input. The second a little quiet opens up, a red light, a line at the store, 10 seconds alone, our hand goes straight for the phone. We've engineered silence right out of our lives, and then we ask why God feels so far away. Here's the possibility the whole Bible keeps pointing at. Maybe God hasn't gone quiet on your generation. Maybe your generation is the first one that's never quiet enough to notice him. The signal never stopped. We just cranked the static up until we couldn't hear it anymore. The prophet Habakkuk wrote that the Lord is in his holy temple and that all the earth should fall silent before him. Not so God could hear us better. So we could finally hear him. And that's the strange, upside-down promise underneath this whole idea. The thing that draws God near isn't performance. It isn't volume, and it isn't doing more. It's the willingness to go quiet. To drop your weapons, like that battlefield verse said. To sit in the room and let the room teach you. To stop striving long enough to notice he was there the entire time. Be still. Not because it's calm, but because he's there. The still small voice is still speaking. It always has been. The only real question is whether we'll ever get quiet enough to hear it. If this changed how you read that verse on the coffee mug, sit with it this week. Find 10 minutes. No phone, no music, nothing scheduled. Just quiet and see what starts to surface once the static finally drops. We're walking through the practices that draw a person closer to God, one at a time. Last time it was fasting. This time, silence. The next one might surprise you most of all. Why God seems to run toward broken people instead of away from them. That video's on screen now. Be still and know